the world of Eldoria. In the heart of the known world, where the winds of change had long been tempered by the weight of tradition, the realm of Eldoria stood as a bastion of ancient customs and unshakable laws. For centuries, the Eldorian Council had ruled with an iron grip, ensuring that the old ways remained untouched by the tides of time. Their decrees were law, their traditions sacred, and their power unchallenged. The people of Eldoria lived by the teachings of the first elders, whose words had been etched into stone and whispered in the halls of the High Keep for generations. To question the past was to invite ruin. To defy the council was to court death. Yet even in the most rigid of societies, the winds of change could not be wholly stilled. Whispers of rebellion stirred in the shadows, carried by those who had grown weary of the council's unyielding rule. The younger generation, raised in an age where the world beyond Eldoria's borders had begun to shift, questioned the wisdom of their forebears. They spoke of lands beyond the mountains, of knowledge that had long been forgotten, and of a future that did not rely on the weight of the past. To them, the council's traditions were not a shield, but a shackle. But the council did not move without purpose. They saw the stirrings of change, and knew that the old ways must be preserved at all costs. The elders, men and women who had lived long enough to witness the rise and fall of empires, understood that history was a river that could not be turned back. The council's traditions were not a shield but a shackle. But the council did not move without purpose. They saw the stirrings of change and knew that the old ways must be preserved at all costs. Seeing the folly of those who had tried to break from the past, and they would not allow Eldoria to suffer the same fate. The council's power was not merely in law, but in the hearts and minds of the people who had been raised to revere the old ways and fear the unknown. And so the stage was set for a great conflict. The traditions of Eldoria, so deeply ingrained in the fabric of its people, would soon be tested by the forces of change. The council, unyielding in their belief that the past must be preserved, would face a challenge unlike any before, and at the center of it all stood one man whose fate would shape the future of Eldoria itself. The son of Lord Dane, a high counselor whose name was spoken with reverence in the halls of the High Keep. From the moment he could walk, Seran had been taught that the past was the foundation upon which Eldoria stood, that the council's decrees were the only true path to prosperity, and that to question the old ways was to invite ruin. His father, a man of rigid principles, had raised him with the belief that Eldoria's strength lay in its unbroken lineage of customs, and that any deviation from them was a betrayal of the realm itself. Yet even as a child, Seran had felt the weight of the world pressing upon him, a world that seemed to whisper of something beyond the stone walls of Eldoria, something that his father and the council refused to acknowledge. As he grew, Seran's curiosity deepened, his mind restless with questions that had no answers in the teachings of the first elders. He had seen the way the younger generation spoke of the lands beyond the mountains, of knowledge that had been lost to time, and of a future that did not rely on the weight of the past. He had heard the stories of those who had traveled to distant lands and returned with tales of wonders that defied the laws of Eldoria. And yet, no matter how much he questioned, no matter how much he searched for answers, the council remained unmoved. To them, the past was sacred, and the future was a threat that must be quelled before it could take root. It was this conflict between the traditions that had shaped him and the yearning for something beyond them that haunted Seran's every step. He was not a rebel, not yet, but he was not blind to the truth that the council refused to see. He had seen the way the people of Eldoria looked upon the council with fear, the way they whispered of change behind closed doors, the way even the most devout of the elders sometimes faltered in their certainty. He had begun to wonder whether the traditions that had defined Eldoria for centuries were truly the only path forward, or whether they were, in truth, a cage that bound the realm to a past that no longer served it. And then, one night, as he pored over the ancient tomes in the library of the High Keep, he found something that would change everything. Hidden within the brittle pages of an old scroll, buried beneath layers of dust and time, was a prophecy, one that spoke of a time when Eldoria would face a great reckoning, when the old ways would be challenged by the forces of change, and when a single soul would rise to shape the future of the realm. The words were written in the hand of the first elders themselves, yet they spoke of something that had long been forgotten, the possibility that tradition was not the only path to strength, that change was not the enemy, but the very thing that had shaped the world before. And in that moment, Seran knew that his fate was no longer his own. The time of reckoning had come, and he would be at the center of it. The antagonist's resolve at the heart of Eldoria's unyielding tradition stood. Lord Dane, a man whose very name was a symbol of the old order, a towering figure with a face weathered by time and a gaze that could pierce the soul of any who dared to question the council's decrees. He was the embodiment of Eldoria's rigid customs. For decades he had served as one of the most influential members of the Eldorian Council, his voice a pillar of strength in the face of uncertainty. To the people of Eldoria, he was not merely a counselor. He was a guardian of their heritage, a protector of the traditions that had bound the realm together for centuries. Lord Dane had no love for change. To him, the past was not a relic to be discarded, but a foundation upon which the future must be built. He had seen the folly of those who had tried to break from the old ways, and he would not allow Eldoria to suffer the same fate. He had watched as the younger generation whispered of rebellion, of knowledge that had long been forgotten, and of a future that did not rely on the weight of the past. To him, these were not signs of progress, but the first tremors of a great collapse. He had seen the rise and fall of empires before, and he knew that the moment the people of Eldoria began to question the council's authority, the realm would crumble. His power was not merely in his words, but in the unshakable belief of the people who had been raised to revere the old ways. The council's decrees were law, and Lord Dane had ensured that they were followed without question. He had spent his life enforcing the traditions of the first elders, ensuring that the teachings of the past remained unchallenged. He had seen the dangers of change, the way it had brought ruin to other lands, and he would not allow Eldoria to fall into the same fate. And yet, for all his strength, there was one man who had begun to challenge him, Seran. The son of a counselor, raised in the same traditions that had shaped Lord Dane's own life, had begun to question the very foundations upon which Eldoria stood. He had read the forbidden tomes, spoken of the future with a curiosity that had once been unthinkable, and now he had discovered a prophecy that spoke of a reckoning that could not be ignored. Lord Dane could not allow this. Seran was not merely a boy who had strayed from the path, he was a threat to the very fabric of Eldoria. If the younger generation continued to question the council's rule, if the people began to believe that change was not a danger but a necessity, then the realm would fall, and Lord Dane would not allow that to happen. The prophecy of the reckoning. The scroll was old, its edges brittle, and its ink faded, yet the words it contained were as sharp as any blade. Seran had read them before, but now, as he traced the ancient script with trembling fingers, the weight of their meaning settled upon him like a storm on the horizon. The prophecy spoke of a time when Eldoria would stand at the precipice of change, when the old ways would be tested by the forces that sought to reshape the world. It told of a reckoning that would come not by war or conquest, but by the very beliefs that had bound the realm together for centuries. The words were written in the hand of the first elders, yet they did not speak of tradition as a virtue, but as a burden. They warned that the past, though sacred, was not unchanging. That the people of Eldoria had long clung to the teachings of their ancestors, but that the world beyond their borders had moved on, and that the council's refusal to acknowledge this would bring ruin upon them. The prophecy spoke of a time when the traditions of Eldoria would be challenged, when the younger generation would rise and question the decrees that had governed them for generations. That the people of Eldoria had long clung to the teachings of their ancestors, but that the world beyond their borders had moved on, and that the council's refusal to acknowledge this would bring ruin upon them. Center of it all, it named a single soul who would shape the future of the realm. Seran's breath caught in his throat as he read the final lines. The prophecy did not name him by name, but the description was unmistakable. A man born of the council, raised in the traditions of the first elders, yet one who would see beyond them. A man who would not follow the path laid before him, but who would forge a new one. The words struck him like a hammer, and for the first time he understood that he was not merely a boy who had strayed from the path. He was the one the prophecy had foretold. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. If the prophecy was true, then the time of reckoning was upon them. The traditions that had defined Eldoria for centuries were no longer unshakable. The council's rule, once unquestioned, would soon be tested by the forces of change. And Seran, whether he wished it or not, would be at the center of it all. The first clash of ideals, the council chamber was a place of power, where the weight of tradition was felt in every stone and every whispered decree. The great hall, with its vaulted ceilings and banners bearing the sigils of Eldoria's long-forged past, had always been a symbol of unshakable authority. But now, as Seran stood before the gathered council, the air was thick with tension. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of a challenge that could not be ignored. "The prophecy speaks of a reckoning," Seran said, his voice ringing through the chamber. "It speaks of a time when Eldoria must choose between the past and the future, and yet the council has chosen to ignore it, to bury the truth beneath layers of tradition and fear." His words were not an accusation, but a revelation, one that had been long buried and now brought to light. The councillors, men and women who had spent their lives upholding the old ways, sat in silence, their faces unreadable. Lord Dane rose from his place at the council's head, his expression dark with fury. "You dare speak of prophecy as if it were a truth?" His voice was low, but it carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that the past remained unchallenged. "The first elders' teachings have guided Eldoria for centuries. To question them is to question the very foundation of our realm." Seran met his father's gaze unflinching. "And what if the foundation is broken?" he asked. "What if the traditions we hold so dear are no longer the path to strength, but the very thing that binds us to ruin?" His voice was firm, his words unrelenting. "I have read the scroll, Lord Dane. I have seen the words written by the first elders themselves. They spoke of a time when the old ways would be tested, when the younger generation would rise and question the decrees that had governed them for generations." A murmur spread through the chamber, a ripple of unease that could not be ignored. Some of the counselors, older men who had seen the world change in ways they had once refused to acknowledge, heard on with wary eyes. Others, those who, what if the Trajan would be tested when the younger generation would rise and question the decrees that had governed, had long upheld the council's rule, turned to Lord Dane for guidance. But Lord Dane was not a man to be swayed by words, no matter how carefully chosen. "You speak of prophecy as if it were a law," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "But the council has ruled Eldoria for centuries, and we have never allowed the past to be questioned. You would have us break our own laws, to cast aside the traditions that have held our realm together for generations." His gaze bore into Seran, as if he could see the truth that his son sought to bring to light. "You are not the first to challenge the council, Seran, and you will not be the last. But you will not be the one who succeeds." The words struck like a hammer, and for a moment Seran faltered. He had known that the council would not welcome his challenge, but he had not expected such a direct rebuke. Yet even as his father's words echoed in his mind, he knew that the time of reckoning had come. The traditions of Eldoria, once unshakable, would soon be tested, and the council's refusal to listen would not go unanswered. A journey beyond the walls! The council's rejection of the prophecy had only strengthened Seran's resolve. He could not return to the High Keep, not while the council sought to silence him, not while his father's voice still echoed in his mind like a warning. The time for words had passed. Now the time for action had come. And so, with the scroll hidden beneath his cloak, Seran left Eldoria behind, stepping beyond the walls. The council's resolve. He could not return to the High Keep, not while the council sought to silence him. Ho! Stone walls that had defined his life. The world beyond Eldoria was vast and untamed, a land of shifting winds and uncharted paths. He traveled through the great forests that bordered the realm, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, their roots entwined in the earth as if whispering the secrets of ages past. He crossed the rivers that had once been the boundaries of Eldoria's influence, their waters reflecting the sky in a way that made him feel both small and infinite. And as he moved deeper into the unknown, he found himself drawn to the people who lived beyond the council's reach, those who had long since abandoned the traditions of Eldoria and forged their own paths. It was in the shadow of the mountains that he first encountered the nomadic tribes of the north. They were those reflecting the sky in a way that made him feel both small and infinite, and as he moved deeper into the unknown, he found himself drawn to the realm, wrecking an Inu Khan, a people unlike any he had ever known, their lives dictated not by the rigid decrees of the council, but by the ebb and flow of the seasons. They spoke of the stars as if they were old friends, of the wind as if it carried the wisdom of the world. They did not revere the past as the first elders had taught, but they did not fear the future either. To them, change was not a threat, but a part of life itself. Seran listened to their stories, their songs, their beliefs, and for the first time he began to understand what the prophecy had meant. The traditions of Eldoria were not the only path to strength, nor were they the only way to live. The council had spent centuries ensuring that the past remained unchallenged, but in doing so, they had ignored the lessons of the world beyond their borders. The prophecy had not been a warning of destruction, but a call to embrace the future, to see that the old ways were not the only path forward, and yet, even as he came to see the truth of the prophecy, he could not shake the weight of his father's words. Lord Dane had spent his life ensuring that the traditions of Eldoria remained unshaken, that the past was never questioned. Was he wrong? Had the council been preserving Eldoria's strength, or had they been binding it to a past that no longer served them? The question gnawed at him, and with each step he took beyond the walls of Eldoria, it grew heavier. The scroll had spoken of a reckoning, of the traditions of Eldoria remained unshaken, that the past was never questioned, Was he wrong? Had the council been preserving Eldoria's strength, or had they been binding it to a past that no longer served them? The old ways would be tested. But now, as Seran stood on the threshold of a world that had long been forgotten by the council, he realized that the reckoning was not just for Eldoria. It was for him as well. The traditions that had shaped his life, the teachings of the first elders, the unwavering belief that the past must be preserved at all costs. These were the very things that had bound him to the council, to his father, to the world he had once known. And now he had to decide whether to return to that world, or to forge a new path entirely. The prophecy had named him as the one who would shape the future of Eldoria. But for the first time, Seran was no longer certain of what that future would look like. The council's desperation Lord Dane stood alone in the council chamber, the weight of Seran's defiance pressing upon him like a storm on the horizon. The boy had vanished, his absence a wound that would not heal. The council had always been unshakable, their authority built upon centuries of tradition, their rule unquestioned by the people of Eldoria. But now, with Seran gone and the prophecy stirring unrest among the younger generation, the council's power was beginning to waver. He had spent his life ensuring that the traditions of Eldoria remained unchallenged, that the past was never questioned, that the people of the realm would never look beyond the teachings of the first elders. And yet Seran had done what no one before him had dared to do. He had defied the council, had spoken the words that had long been forbidden, and had set in motion a reckoning that could not be ignored. The prophecy, once buried beneath layers of time and fear, had now become a fire that burned through the very foundation of Eldoria's rule. Lord Dane knew that the council could not afford to let this continue. If the younger generation continued to question the decrees that had governed them for generations, if they began to believe that change was not a threat but a necessity, then the realm would fall. He had seen the rise and fall of empires before, and he would not allow Eldoria to suffer the same fate. He had to act. He called upon the council, his voice steady, his words unrelenting. Seran has left Eldoria, but he is not beyond our reach. He is the boy who has spoken of prophecy, who has challenged the very foundation of our rule. If we do not act now, the people will begin to believe his words, and the traditions we have upheld for centuries will be cast aside. The councillors listened, their faces lined with worry. Some of them, the older ones who had seen the world change in ways they had once refused to acknowledge, looked upon Lord Dane with unease. Others, those who had long upheld the council's rule, nodded in agreement. The time for words had passed. Now, the time for action had come. And so, the council sent envoys to the lands beyond Eldoria to seek out Seran and bring him back. They would not allow the prophecy to take root, would not let the traditions of Eldoria be forgotten. The past must be preserved at all costs, even if it meant casting aside the boy who had dared to challenge them. The reckoning of Eldoria. The storm had gathered over Eldoria, its winds howling with the weight of change. The council had sent their envoys, but they had returned empty-handed. Seran had vanished into the unknown, his defiance a challenge that could not be ignored. And now, as the younger generation of Eldoria began to speak of the prophecy in hushed voices, as the people of the realm looked upon the council with wary eyes, the moment of reckoning had come. Seran stood at the gates of the high keep, his cloak heavy with the dust of the journey that had brought him back. The scroll was hidden beneath his tattered robes, its words still burning in his mind. He had seen. The world beyond Eldoria had walked among the nomadic tribes, had listened to the stories of those who had long since abandoned the traditions that had bound his people for centuries. He had seen the truth of the prophecy, the weight of the past that had shaped Eldoria, and the future that was now within his grasp. But the council would not allow this. Lord Dane had gathered the councillors in the great hall, their voices rising in a chorus of fury. Seran has defied us, has cast aside the traditions that have held Eldoria together for generations. He has spoken of prophecy as if it were a law, as if the past must be cast aside for the sake of the future. But the past is not a burden. It is the foundation upon which our realm stands. His voice was sharp, his words unrelenting. If we do not act now, the people will begin to believe his lies, and the traditions we have upheld for centuries will be cast aside. Seran stepped forward, his eyes burning with the fire of conviction. The past is not a burden, Lord Dane. It is a lesson. And the council has spent too long in the shadows of the past, refusing to see the world beyond Eldoria's walls. His voice rang through the chamber, his words cutting through the chamber, his words cutting through the silence that had settled over the council. The prophecy is not a warning of destruction. It is a call to embrace the future. The traditions we hold so dear have kept us safe for centuries, but they have also kept us stagnant. The younger generation is not asking for change for the sake of change. They are asking for a future that does not rely on the weight of the past. The councillors murmured among themselves, their faces lined with uncertainty. Some of them, the older ones who had seen the world shift in ways they had once refused to acknowledge, looked upon Seran with a mixture of fear and understanding. Others, those who had long upheld the council's rule, turned to Lord Dane for guidance. But Lord Dane was not a man who could be swayed by words, no matter how carefully chosen. You speak of the future as if it were a promise, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But the future is uncertain, and the past is the only thing that has ever kept Eldoria strong. You would have us break our own laws to cast aside. So matter how carefully chosen. The traditions that have held our realm together for generations. His gaze bore into Seran, as if he could see the truth that his son sought to bring to light. You are not the first to challenge the council, Seran, and you will not be the last. But you will not be the one who succeeds. The word struck like a hammer. And for a moment Seran faltered. He had known that the council would not welcome his challenge, but he had not expected such a direct rebuke. Yet even as his father's words echoed in his mind, he knew that the time of reckoning had come. The traditions of Eldoria, once unshakable, would soon be tested, and the council's refusal to listen would not go unanswered. And so, the battle for Eldoria's future began. Eldoria. The battle for Eldoria's future had come to a head, and the prophecy had been fulfilled. The council had refused to listen, had clung to the traditions that had bound the realm for centuries, and in doing so, they had set in motion the very reckoning that the first elders had foretold. The younger generation, no longer content to live in the shadow of the past, had risen in defiance, their voices echoing through the streets of Eldoria. The council's rule, once unquestioned, now stood on the precipice of collapse. Seran had not returned to the high keep with words alone. He had returned with the knowledge that the council had long denied, with the truth that the people of Eldoria had been forced to ignore. He had seen the world beyond the walls of Eldoria, had counsel, had crombo, and had not returned to the Tridio quauked. The Oftresmation had deers want tea. Walked among those who had long since abandoned the traditions that had bound them for generations and had come to understand that the past was not a prison but a lesson. The traditions of Eldoria had been the foundation upon which the realm had been built, but they had also been the very thing that had kept it stagnant. The younger generation was not asking for change for the sake of change. They were asking for a future that did not rely on the weight of the past, and so the council had fallen. Not in a single moment, but in the slow, inevitable unraveling of the very traditions that had once held Eldoria together. The people had begun to question the decrees that had governed them for generations, had begun to see the world beyond the walls of Eldoria not as a threat, but as a possibility. The prophecy had not been a warning of destruction, but a call to embrace the future. And now, as the council stood at the edge of their own undoing, they had no choice but to face the truth that Seran had long known. In the end, it was not the council that had shaped the future of Eldoria, but the people who had chosen to believe in something greater than the past. The traditions of Eldoria would not be cast aside, but they would no longer be the only path forward. The realm would not be ruled by the weight of the past, but by the strength of those who had dared to challenge it. And as Seran stood at the gates of the High Keep, he knew that the future of Eldoria had been forged, not by the council, but by those who had dared to believe in something more than the traditions that had bound them for centuries. The echoes of Eldoria. The winds of Eldoria had changed, and with them the very fabric of the realm. The traditions that had once defined the people of Eldoria, the rigid decrees of the council, the unshakable belief in the past as the only path forward. These had not been cast aside, but they had been challenged, tested, and reshaped by the very people who had once feared the future. The prophecy had not been a warning of destruction, but a call to embrace the unknown, to see that the past was not a prison, but a foundation upon which a new future could be built. And now, as the people of Eldoria stood at the crossroads of tradition and change, they had to ask themselves what that future would look like. The council had fallen, not in the single moment of rebellion, but in the slow, inevitable unraveling of the very traditions that had once held Eldoria together. The younger generation, once content to live in the shadow of the past, had risen in defiance, had questioned the decrees that had governed them for generations, and had demanded a future that did not rely on the weight of the past. And yet, they had not cast aside the traditions of Eldoria entirely. They had not burned the tomes of the first elders, nor had they torn down the great halls of the High Keep. Instead, they had taken the lessons of the past and woven them into the fabric of a new future. But the cost of this reckoning had not been without its price. The council's refusal to listen had led to the very conflict they had feared, and in their desperation to preserve the old ways, they had ignored the very thing that had once made Eldoria strong. The traditions that had once bound the realm together had become a cage, and only by breaking free from them had Eldoria found the strength to move forward. And yet, even as the council had fallen, even as the old ways had been challenged, the people of Eldoria still carried the weight of the past upon their shoulders. The traditions that had shaped them for centuries would not be forgotten, but they would no longer be the only path forward. Seran had not returned as the boy who had once questioned the council, nor as the man who had sought to cast aside the traditions of Eldoria. He had returned as the one who had seen the truth of the prophecy, who had walked beyond the walls of the realm and returned with a new understanding of what Eldoria could be. And now, as the people of Eldoria looked to the future, they knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The traditions of the past would not be cast aside, but they would no longer be the only path forward. The future of Eldoria would be shaped not by the weight of the past, but by the strength of those who had dared to believe in something more. And so, as the sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light upon the land of Eldoria, the people of the realm stood at the threshold of a new era. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but its meaning would not be forgotten. The past had shaped them, but the future was theirs to forge. And in the echoes of Eldoria, the story of tradition and change would continue to be told, not as a warning, but as a lesson that would shape the world for generations to come. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.